Hey, this is Darren, head of remote at GitLab, and today I'm joined by Danny. She has some pretty fascinating questions related to remote and HR, and we're in pretty interesting times, so I think it's a fairly timely topic. So Danny, thank you so much for joining me. Give the audience a bit of an overview of who you are, what you do, and feel free to dive into your questions.
Sure. Thanks, Darren. My name is Danny. I'm the Senior Manager of Content Marketing at Ceridian. Ceridian is a global human capital management company, and our flagship solution is called Dayforce. It's a single human capital management platform, and our customers use it to manage their employee lifecycle from end to end. So we work a lot with people leaders, CFOs, HR leaders, CEOs about how best to drive value by making intelligent people decisions. So particularly now, in this kind of disrupted world of work that we're in, I really wanted to ask you some questions, Darren, get your perspective being GitLab being an OG remote work company.
I like that. Yes, yes, indeed. We take that to heart. We take that to heart. We've been doing it, I guess, before it was cool. But no, it's been good to do it this long because now we're able to share some of those trials and tribulations and help others now that it's more meaningful than ever.
Yeah, exactly. So let me dive into, I think, a big question, and I've seen a lot of articles about this and people calling this big, massive work from home experiment. But, what do you guys think? Like, do you think this pandemic is going to lead to a permanent shift to remote work for some companies?
Yeah, so I'll address the first part of that question first. I don't love that it's called the world's biggest work from home experiment. It's not. This is crisis-driven work from home. It is not in any way related to actual intentional remote. They're very different. I actually met with a team earlier today. They've been kind of forced work from home for about 3 weeks now. And a lot of them said, I'm kind of just feeling drained and zapped. Like everything takes so much effort. And I said, that has less to do with working remotely and more to do with your entire world shifted overnight. You were thrust into a work environment that is nothing like the one that you came from, not to mention everything else going on around you in the world. So it's different. And I think as we get through this, I'm actually really proud of humanity for how quickly we're adapting and how agile we're being. I do think that on the other side of this, people will be more comfortable with it. They'll figure out what works, what doesn't work. There's a lot of forced iteration on trying things out right now. I think that's going to yield some pretty awesome benefits on the other side of it. The second part of that question is the more interesting one, I think. Is this going to lead to a permanent shift in remote work? I think that this has accelerated the global embrace of remote by at least 10 years, at least. One of the biggest things it has done is break the myth of your job can't be done from anywhere. For many jobs, that is not the case. And we're seeing that play out in real time. Even highly regulated industries, it is possible. Now, this isn't the ideal situation for it to happen. Definitely ops and business IT leaders have to work on some access issues and things like that to make it more seamless, but it is possible. And the way I see it is you're never going to put this genie back in the bottle. If you give people the freedom and autonomy to work from anywhere for 3 or 4 months and they're able to accomplish their work, if they're asked to resume their 2, 3, 4 hour commutes and disrupt their lives again, I'm not so sure that the masses are going to be amenable to that. And that's just on the worker side. On the business side, you have business leaders right now that are looking for ways to cut costs to kind of manage through this situation. One of the obvious ones that comes up is real estate. And we're now having this great awakening to the reality of decoupling geography and results. You can de-risk your business if you're not tied to a specific geographic region. We've seen some hotspots like Milan. Businesses in Milan have suffered even more than other places. It has nothing to do with their business fundamentals. It's just because they happen to be based in Milan. And so you're seeing this as an opportunity to de-risk your business by decoupling the geography side of it. I'll actually mention one other thing. There's been a recent survey from Gartner, and they surveyed over 300 CFOs globally. And 74% of them said that they intend to shift some of their workforce to remote permanently through this. And this is really amazing to me because, again, this is a suboptimal situation. This is not an ideal time or place or scenario or environment to just thrust everyone into remote. And even despite that, businesses are still seeing the benefits. And even despite having to be at home and essentially double duty as a homeschool teacher for parents with kids, they're still seeing the benefits of not having to commute and more time with family and more time to devote to their own lives. So I am optimistic about the future. I think that more positives will be seen of this than negatives. But I don't think work will ever look quite the same.
Let's talk about that a little bit more. What you were just saying around, how businesses are looking at, what they can change or shift for the longer term. And also a lot of people are just talking about business continuity right now. Can we talk a little bit more about how remote work can kind of support business resiliency? You talked about real estate a little bit. What are some other ways?
It just makes your company more dynamic. If you're in an industry where you need to support a client 24/7, and you need everyone in the same geographic place, you're essentially asking 2/3 of your support staff to work suboptimal hours and a full third of them to work overnight. Not really ideal, not a great employee experience. Or you can open that up globally and support clients 24/7 at times that make more sense for the people. So you get a more diverse workforce. And the more distributed you are, the less susceptible you are to risk in any given place, any single place. And I think business leaders are realizing that from a business continuity and a de-risking standpoint, the further we can get from being centrally located now seems like a great idea. And it's amazing because just 6 months ago, it was almost completely the opposite. People wanted to have the mothership, have the centralization, but they're realizing that while there are some perks to that, there's a lot of risk that comes with that. And this COVID-19 situation has kind of forced open the reality that we were always a lot closer to being able to function well as a society remotely than we ever gave ourselves credit for. In ubiquitous LTE, laptops that can last all day, essentially anyone in the working world right now even communicates with their family through text message. You don't necessarily need face-to-face to get something done or to have a relationship. We know more about this than we've given ourselves credit for as a society. And the hurdle to making it work in the working world was actually a lot lower than I think a lot of people thought. And frankly, companies have been remote for a long time. You have executives that are on planes every week. When you're working on a presentation deck 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, you're working remotely. You might not call it that, but you're working remotely. And then when you land in an office in London, but you're communicating with staff back in Phoenix, you're remote to each other. So this has been happening for a really long time. There's just been this awakening of, okay, we can dub it remote and actually put in some proper infrastructure to do this right now that we all agree that it's happening.
Talk about that a little bit more. The idea around, a lot of companies are actually remote, but they might not see themselves that way. So there was this Atlantic article recently, and someone was quoted in there saying, well, yeah, remote work isn't necessarily working for people right now because we spent the last 120 years learning how people can be productive in an office. So, and that article also talks about how remote work is a different kind of work, and people have to learn like new habits, new ways of working, new ways of tracking productivity, all of that. So, this sounds like, and, we've just talked about this, like there's this big kind of mindset shift or attitude shift that needs to take place in the way that people kind of look at work within this existing framework. So I guess, what would you recommend, or what would you say to business leaders to kind of get that mind shift going and like make it broad across the organization?
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic. The first thing I would say is acknowledge to yourself that it's different. So I think there's this fallacy that having an entire team or a company working from home, it's actually the same as it's always been. It's just that your desk looks a little different. And here's what I liken it to. If you're driving a vehicle with the steering wheel on the left side and you just magically switch countries and you're still in the same car, but you have to drive on the opposite side of the road, it's familiar, but still oddly difficult. You're not quite sure why it still doesn't feel quite in sync. It's like you're still driving the car, but the rules of the road have changed quite a bit. And everyone around you that's in this new country, they seem to just get it. It's like, well, they've been motoring around on these streets. Why am I the only one that can't quite figure this out? I think remote is much like that. So I think the first thing leaders need to do is understand that you're thrusting, or your team has been thrust into this situation where now everyone's desk looks different, everyone's access and connectivity is different. There's a lot more variables now. So you're going to have to communicate more than you've ever done in the past. And more importantly, you're going to need to be more receptive to feedback than you've ever been in the past, because everyone has different blockers. Like what used to be uniform, or what you thought was uniform, is no longer the case. And so there's a higher burden than ever now, I think, on managers to be open to feedback, be receptive to feedback, and help unblock and solve challenges that are new to the remote world.
That's a great way to think about it.
I do want to mention one other thing quickly on the what we're used to front. I had this conversation with someone the other day. Even from a young age in education, we're put into classrooms and we're taught how to function in this box. Essentially, grade school is office work for kids. But no one ever teaches us how to do school at home. It's like, here's some homework, figure it out. And we all just kind of like fumble through it at home. No one really has any guardrails around it. It's always this big struggle. That's kind of similar to what's happening now. No one has really been taught how to work remotely. And people have different levels of what I call remote fluency, different levels of appreciation and understanding and comfortability with doing something outside of the workspace. Then there's the reality that not everyone's home is equally amenable to being an ideal workspace. So at GitLab, people opt into this and they're able to expense their home office and set their home office up to be ergonomic and comfortable. And so we have pretty amazing workspaces. I would say better than what you would find in the office. But for someone that on Monday was working in the office and now Tuesday, henceforth, they're working in their 1-bedroom apartment with their spouse, with their kids, with essentially one room for everything to happen. Obviously, they're going to be at a disadvantage. Even if you carve out some sort of curtained off space where they can work, it's not going to be ideal. And so productivity metrics have to change. Expectations have to change. The flow of communication and feedback has to change. It's not the same. And not everyone is on the same playing field. And I think it's important for leaders to understand that and do whatever they can to level the playing field. In that instance I just gave, even being more lenient on expensing, like let people expense a nice keyboard and a secondary monitor and noise canceling headphones so they can actually be productive and do work. And you got to remember, they're probably leaving $5,000 or $10,000 worth of gear at the office, and now they have to work in their kitchen. So some differences that need to be accounted for sure.
You brought up a great point more broadly there too about, there are a lot of, I guess, traditional frameworks that we work in and operate in, and that people maybe need to get more comfortable with working outside those, whether it's work, whether it's payday, getting paid every 2 weeks or on the same frequency versus, with the rise of the gig economy and other types of workers, there's an expectation to be paid differently. Or we were talking about learning. Now that suddenly we find ourselves not with kids not being able to go to school, or like the need for upskilling, like how do we do that differently? So this is, a big kind of shift that, to your point, people need to maybe open their minds to a little bit, or try and get more comfortable with this new norm.
One of the biggest tips I have is to just get comfortable with the uncomfortability. There's as much to unlearn about working as there is to learn when you're coming into a remote environment. And the tighter you try to cling on to what worked in the office, and the more closely you try to press copy from the office norms and paste them into a virtual world, the worse it's going to go. And I will say there are different phases of remote. The skeuomorphism, the kind of copy and paste thing, is phase one, where you're just trying to make it work. You had a meeting in the office, let's try to have that same meeting virtually. But the point is, you should strive to get beyond that. You should strive to move to a more asynchronous model, and a model where there's more transparency. And I think this is a huge one. In the office, transparency is not only not necessary for some things, it's actually actively avoided for many things. Everything is an as needed basis, because everyone is just 3 or 4 feet from you. So it's very easy to kind of loop someone in at the moment you think they need to be looped in. But when you destroy that construct and you have people all over the world and you have no concept of how close they actually are to you, you have to kind of let that guard down and be okay being more transparent about how you communicate as a company, be more transparent about how different departments are marching towards their own goals. Like open up those goals so that finance knows what engineering is aiming for and engineering knows what HR people ops is aiming for. And if that spooks you, you really need to get introspective and ask why. Why? You're one company, you're all marching towards one common goal. And if there's some fear in transparency, it might be because you need to work some things out. Like that, what you're feeling is accountability. And on the whole, remote forces you to be a lot more disciplined than you otherwise can get away with. And the important point there is every company should be this disciplined. It's just that remote makes it glaringly obvious that you have no other choice. So I think companies that wrap their arms around that instead of run away from that in this time, even if they do transition back into the office, they'll be a more disciplined company with better communication, and people will feel more aligned and feel more tightly integrated as a team, even if some of them stay outside of the office.
I think that's a great takeaway. And building on that a little more tactically, I guess, if you were speaking to a leader or a person leading a remote team, whether they're brand new to the game or they've been doing it for a while, like what skills would you recommend that they develop? And when I shared some questions with you earlier, I don't mean like let's develop leadership skills or communication skills, but are there like some specific or maybe not thought of skills that are important to make this successful?
Yeah, especially for people that are used to kind of the command and control type of operations in an office. The first would be reevaluate how clear the metrics are for your direct reports. So I would immediately have one-on-ones with all of my newly remote team members and ask them straight up, do you understand what success looks like? Because the funny thing about working in an office is praises and promotion can be very subjective. You can kind of get away with not really expecting a certain metric or takeaway from someone. In a remote setting, you can't. You can only judge them on results. Trying to judge them on hours spent or like how many hours they spent in front of a webcam is just absurd. And it's glaringly obvious that it's absurd. So step number one is, as a manager, have those one-on-ones and ask your teammates, do you know what I need of you? And if they say no, that's on the manager to get more articulate and more prescriptive about what those objectives and key results are. The second thing is to lead with empathy. I think in these times of crisis, it's very easy to just default to let's implement more rules. Let's put more guardrails around. I need to have some sort of construct of command in this situation. But you have to realize that people have a lot more going on right now than work, a lot. And the best leaders are going to be the ones that start conversations with that. Like, hey, how's the family? Are things okay? And after that's talked about, then let's talk about work, because remote combined with the situation we're in makes more clear than ever that we're humans first and colleagues second. And a good way to turn a worker off is to just not recognize that. And I think the final thing is, if you've been in a command and control type of situation, it's very difficult to switch your brain to servant leadership. But I recommend to newly remote leaders, one of the first things you should do is simply open your arms as wide as you can and accept feedback. Because again, everyone is in a different spot right now. You think you know what's going on, but you actually don't. And the only way you're going to have a clear picture of what's going on is to ask people how it's going. And I advise people to take as much of that feedback as you can, because you'll probably see some common threads. If you ask enough people, you'll say, oh, okay, like 40% of these people have relatively this same problem. That's your priority list. That becomes the priority of what do we fix and in what order and what documentation clearly needs to exist that we don't have already. So those are the top three things, and then you'll learn from there. It's important to remember that remote is a journey, not a binary switch that you just flip on and off. You'll get better at it. Just continue to iterate and tell your team that. Tell your team that, hey, we're remote today, but we weren't yesterday, so we're probably not going to be excellent at it right away. And for high-performing teams, this can be really jarring. So it needs to be said, hey, let's change our expectations and focus on iterations instead of just focusing on how quickly we can master something that we had no experience with prior.
I think those are some great action items for leaders far and wide and in many different roles as well. Let me ask you my last question. People likely ask you a lot of questions about remote work, and I have read a lot of the all remote guides. So you note in there, typically we get asked this a lot, but what's a question that people don't ask you, but you think they should ask you about remote work?
I love this question. What I wish people would ask me more is, what could life look like if I get good at remote? One of the toughest things about my job is getting people to actually use and unlock their imagination. And what you're seeing happen in mass is people are being thrust into remote and they're trying as hard as they can to replicate the experience they just left. So if they work 9 to 5, they're trying to figure out exactly how to work 9 to 5 at home, even if it's clearly not the ideal situation at home. They're just trying to make it work. Whatever rigidity they were used to, they want to maintain that rigidity here. And I just want people to give themselves permission to not do that. You're in a whole different universe now. You don't have the commute anymore. You don't have the same stigma and expectations anymore. You can potentially shift your day to work during your peak productivity hours, and that opens up hours that have never been accessible to you before to do other things in life with other people, maybe people that you've forgotten about because the times never were compatible. It's the ultimate blank slate. It's the ultimate life cheat code. And I don't think enough people give themselves permission to recognize that. There's this kind of remoter's guilt where you feel like you need to overproduce as a remote employee to compensate for the fact that you don't have to run the commute rat race anymore. But you got to remember, the commute was never the employer's to begin with. That was always your time. So you can do something with it. You can be innovative with it. You can plan something with it. And so that's what I wish more people would ask me is, hey, what could life look like if I never had to commute again? If I did not have to be in this city for work, what could life look like? I think there's a lot of power in that. If you have millions of people asking that at the same time, and for me, that's part of the excitement that's coming from this. I'm seeing people rally around community in a way that I haven't seen in a really long time. Remote communities are sprouting up everywhere. We're recognizing overnight that you don't need face-to-face networking, that people are people, no matter the medium in which you meet them. It's exciting. I think that we will, as a society, start to tap into each other's imagination coming out of this. And I actually think it'll make businesses stronger. We've all had situations where we go off on some vacation and we have the best work idea we've ever had without ever even thinking about work. That shouldn't be a once a year thing. That can be an ongoing thing. So that's what I wish people would ask me. What can I do that I could not do in the conventional co-located environment?
I think your point, asking that question, applicable to employees and leaders alike in terms of how they move forward. So that's a
absolutely.
great takeaway.
Absolutely. I mean, leaders are people too. What could you do as a leader? How could you empower your team to connect and build bonds in ways that you couldn't do before? To me, it all comes down to the scarcity versus abundance mindset. If you get thrust into remote and you focus on what can't we do because we don't have access to the office, that's the only thing you'll see. That's the lens in which you're looking through everything with. Or you can say, what opportunities do we have to do things different, to be more innovative? Because we don't have the burden of the office. We don't have the burden of the commute. We don't have the burden of you have to look a certain way when you walk into the office. That's the right question to ask. And so I hope leaders, once things are stabilized, that's the second order thinking, is let's focus on what we can do now that we have some continuity in place.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Darren, for your time.
Absolutely, Danny. Thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate it.